Hey guys, this is the Bishop with Radio Rothbard. Thank you for listening to Radio Rothbard. Always great to hear from our fans out there. And I wanted to let you guys know that we are still in our year-end fundraising drive. Yes, 2024 has flown by. We are excited for big things in 2025, but we need help from people like you. We have no billionaire donors. We certainly receive no government money. We are only supported by people that care about the mission of the Mises Institute. You can donate today throughout the end of the year at Mises.org/Radio Rothbard 24. You donate $25 or more, you'll get a copy of Tom DeLorenzo's newest booklet, The Axis of Evil, America's Three Worst Presidents. Again, thank you for being a listener throughout this year. Have a very Merry Christmas, and we'll see you in 2025.
Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMakin, Executive Editor at the Mises Institute. And it's Christmas time, 2024. So for this episode of Radio Rothbard, I thought we might take a little look at the long tradition of worrying about if Christmas is becoming too consumerist or not. Some may think this is a very new thing, but it's not. It goes back at least several centuries. And there have always been moralists worried about people buying too much on Christmas. For example, when questioned about the propriety of eating meat on Christmas if it fell on Friday, which of course was a day of fasting and a day that you deprived yourself of things, St. Francis of Assisi reportedly responded, "You sin, brother, calling the day on which the child was born to us a day of fast. It is my wish that even the walls should eat meat on such a day, and if they cannot, they should be smeared with meat on the outside." Unquote. Francis, of course, was known for his austere lifestyle, yet he correctly concluded it was a terrible idea to forego the basic material pleasures of life on a day like Christmas. Contra Francis, however, there is little doubt that many now believe the pleasures we enjoy on Christmas, somewhere along the line, got out of hand. Thus, it has become cliché to bemoan the commercialization of Christmas. This critique permeates popular culture, and everyone who's ever seen a Charlie Brown Christmas has heard the message. Christmas is being ruined by too much consumption, and all you really need on Christmas is a tiny little tree and some friends. Only by abandoning material luxuries, we are told, can we appreciate the true meaning of Christmas. The origins of these worries go back at least to the late 19th century, when mass production for middle and working class households accelerated. For the first time in both Europe and North America, an ordinary person might hope to take a little time off work, buy some extra toys and food, and enjoy some of the bounty and the good life that the aristocrats had long taken for granted. This development, however, appeared to trouble intellectuals and the upper classes, who looked with disdain upon the crass displays of holiday cheer enjoyed by ordinary working people. This thinking was applied with special gusto to Christmas time, but it was part of a general distrust of markets expressed by the old aristocrats and guardians of culture, who preferred a world of refined tastes, untouched by the new consumer culture where ordinary people were gaining both economic and political power. Although the old scolds and Puritans could not come up with any standard to demarcate how much holiday opulence was too much, it was thought that most people could not handle this new abundance. Early on in England, for example, the aristocrats feared that regular people lacked the moral constitution to handle any sizable increase in access to luxuries. As historian Robert Kelly describes it, quote, "When some of the laboring pool in the 18th century began to drink tea and enjoy a few other simple amenities such as wheat bread and candles, there was a great outcry at the moral degradation of the working classes, and taxes were immediately placed on these new objects of consumption." Unquote. In America, which lacked an ancient aristocracy, the situation was different, but the same impulse was present. Nostalgic agrarians objected to the increase in consumer goods coming out of cities. Republican simplicity required the rejection of luxury and excess. More broadly speaking, even the relatively laissez-faire Jacksonians, who were laudably less enthusiastic about taxation than the British aristocrats, were suspicious of the proliferation of consumer goods. Even in America, consumer capitalism and civic virtue were not commonly associated with each other in the early 19th century. But any judgment about luxury or abundance in this context is quite arbitrary, and any attempt to impose limits on these goods and services is equally so. St. Francis, for his part, appeared to be unafraid of the overindulgence at Christmas, at least in terms of food. But perhaps this was because in Francis's time, there were few opportunities to consume large amounts of anything. Although the 13th century was a period in which the economic state of Europe improved far and above what had been the case a few centuries earlier, nearly all Europeans' lifestyles were still not much above subsistence levels. A poor harvest could still bring hunger or even famine. Things even went into reverse in the 14th century, when the first half of the century brought widespread famine in much of Europe, with crop yields dropping 40% or more in some places thanks to global cooling. The middle of the century brought the Black Death. The problem then wasn't abundance, but deprivation. This tenuous grip on life's basic pleasures and necessities improved for most human beings in Europe as industrialization grew. Thanks to the rise of global trade, the expansion of a European financial system, and the building of mills and factories, the European standard of living, especially in the most industrialized areas of northwestern Europe, rose to never-before-seen levels. Perhaps nothing better illustrates the arbitrary nature of judgments about luxury and consumerism than economic progress over time. As Ludwig von Mises pointed out, the use of a fork was once looked upon as a form of opulence, but forks are hardly a luxury today. Similarly, not even the most moralistic Christmas gatekeeper today would claim that artificial lighting and wheat bread are some sort of indulgence. The Americans who once bashed modest purchases of unnecessary toys now have moved on to far larger and more expensive targets. Faced with the arguments against 18th century luxury, many modern working-class people today are likely to conclude, if buying light bulbs and wheat bread risks moral decline, I'll take my chances. This state of relative plenty is all thanks to the so-called consumer economy itself, which is nothing more than a process that delivers what the great mass of the population needs and desires. Residents of the industrialized world need no longer worry that a bad harvest will lead to starvation or that a flood will lead to permanent destitution. With industrialization and the proliferation of markets comes luxury, but what exactly constitutes luxury remains utterly relative. Children have long been among the chief beneficiaries of this alleged luxury, perhaps most especially at Christmas time. Children's toys and Christmas are now all bound up together in a variety of Christmas rituals that are deemed by many as simply essential to the Christmas season. This is not new, however, and the trend dates back centuries to the earliest decades when the industrialization of early modern Europe provided an economic surplus that brought new child-centered aspects to the Christmas holiday. Giving toys to children is not new, as noted by Nicholas Orme in his book Medieval Children. Baby rattles date at least to Aristotle's time, and the philosopher himself praised rattles as, quote, a means of allowing children to expend their energy without doing damage, unquote. Orme describes how, by the Middle Ages, children had access to a variety of simple toys, such as small windmills and spinning tops, which were called by a variety of different names by children with slangs such as prill and whirligig. Girls had dolls, called poppets in those days, which required more imaginative types of play. Adults helped children access these toys, and adults produced these toys. Some adults made toys designed to be sold to others at markets. Some may have even been produced via mass production, employing craftsmen and craftswomen producing the toys at home for sale by merchants. The question remains, however, as to how much emphasis adults of these earlier times put on providing amusements for children, and to what end. In his influential book, Centuries of Childhood, Philippe Arié notes a change in how adults viewed childhood amusements in the late Middle Ages and in the early modern period. Arié describes how by the 16th century, Western Europeans had begun to leave behind the large communal festivals of earlier centuries at which children had a role, but were certainly not the focus of attention. This led to a shift in how children were integrated into holiday festivals. Evidence provided by Arié includes the painting The Feast of St. Nicholas, produced by Dutch artist Jan Steen in the 1660s. REA describes the scene portrayed in the painting. Quote, "The grown-ups have organized the occasion to entertain the children. It is the feast of St. Nicholas, the ancestor of Santa Claus. Steen catches the moment when the parents are helping the children to find the toys, which they have hidden all over the house for them. Some of the children have already found their toys. Some little girls are holding dolls. Others are carrying buckets full of toys. There are some shoes lying about. Perhaps it was already customary to hide toys in shoes. Those shoes which children of the 19th and 20th centuries in some countries put in front of the fire on Christmas Eve. This is no longer a great collective festival, but a quiet family celebration, and consequently this concentration on the family is continued by a concentration of the family around the children. Family feasts became children's feasts." Unquote. It is significant that this image was created by a Dutch painter. Such scenes were more common in the Dutch Republic, where a merchant-focused bourgeois political economy had transformed the Dutch population into one of the world's most prosperous. REA suggests this painting reflects the, quote, "same modern feeling for childhood and the family," unquote, that is today reflected in child-centered holiday rituals. Yet this focus on delighting in children's play was not universally well received. Many moralists of the 17th and 18th centuries cautioned repeatedly against coddling children. One etiquette guide cautioned against becoming the sort of supposedly tiresome person, quote, "who never talks of anything but their wives, their little children, and their nannies," unquote. Saint Jean-Baptiste de La Salle condemned parents for treating their children, quote, "in an idolatrous manner," unquote, with the attitude of what the children want, the parents want too. As Orme shows, parents in every age felt affection toward their children and generally wished for their safety and happiness. This can manifest itself differently in different times and places, however. In some periods, both ordinary parents and elites regarded facilitating children's play as not only good for the child, but as delightful for the parents witnessing it. In other times and places, molders of public opinion have viewed such attitudes as prone to excess, resulting in spoiling the child. To modernize, of course, the alleged problem of spoiling children in the 16th century will appear as much ado about nothing. Thanks to centuries of slow capital accumulation, the textile trade, merchant shipping, and other forms of economic progress, England, northern France, and the Low Countries had enjoyed just enough prosperity to give their children buckets full of toys. By modern standards, however, the standard of living in even the wealthiest parts of Europe remained far below what would come in the 19th century and afterward. In southern and eastern Europe, of course, the standard of living tended to be even lower. In this period, child labor was also widespread out of necessity. Families often could not produce a comfortable income on just the labors of the mother and father. Farming and artisan families required help from children, and older children often became servants in other households. So, while small children were enjoying the fruits of economic progress, childhood remained much shorter than it is today, thanks to the need for children to produce some form of income in the marketplace. Trends toward focusing on children accelerate in the 19th century. In her book on children's literature, Kimberly Reynolds writes that the role of the Victorians in, quote-unquote, inventing childhood has been much exaggerated. Yet it is also true that during the Victorian period, quote, "the middle and upper classes evolved a more self-conscious and sustained myth of childhood than any that had gone before," unquote. Micah Lauvert adds, quote, "the 19th century saw a dramatic change in the image of and thinking about the child and childhood. The pre-Raphaelite painter John Everett Millais has famously immortalized the new formed ideas about children and the child's culture in his 1886 Pears soap advertisement. The child depicted in the advertisement is a kind of cherub, a beautiful, innocent, vulnerable dreamer that has to be taken care of, washed, dressed, fed, and cured. The innocent child was very much situated within the pastoral tradition, with its longing for and wish to preserve childlike innocence. The 19th century has been notably phrased the age of the child by Swedish pedagogue Ellen Key because of its focus on the child and his or her well-being, education, and health," unquote. It is remarkable that the 19th century might be known as the age of the child, because it is in this same period that we often hear of how countless children were forced to work in the factories, also known as the quote-unquote satanic mills. This, we are told, was brought about by the second wave of industrialization that had begun in the 18th century and became far more intense by Victorian times. How could anyone call this period of time marked by new concerns for children when so many allegedly were being worked to death in factories? The answer lies in the fact that the age of child labor was actually moving quickly toward its own demise by the late 19th century. This trend was brought about by the factories themselves. As Ralph Raico notes in his work on the Industrial Revolution, contrary to the Marxian myth of the working classes being impoverished by industrialization, the truth was that ordinary people were actually enjoying higher incomes and more access to goods and services as the second half of the 19th century advanced. This meant that child labor was becoming less necessary to secure a subsistence living. And as the economic lot of households improved, children worked less, at least less hazardous jobs. Many Victorians welcomed the trend. This also meant that the falling cost of producing goods and services also made a wide variety of products more affordable. Markets were responding to Victorian ideals of childhood, and this helped ensure that children's goods would expand along with other markets. In turn, the availability of so many books and toys then reinforced Victorian views of childhood, and these ideas spread as, quote, childhood innocence, unquote, became feasible for more and more people. Thus, it is no coincidence that the boom in mass-produced goods made specially for children, as historian Jennifer Satower puts it, quote, coincided closely with the rise of the middle classes, industry, and capitalism, unquote. For many, this new Victorian middle-class emphasis on children affected the way they viewed popular holidays as well. The initial impulses reflected in Steen's The Feast of St. Nicholas were ultimately made more common, attainable, and opulent by growing economies in the 19th century. This was all finally translated into its modern form for American audiences by Clement Moore in his 1823 poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, also known as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. In it, St. Nicholas appears with a sleigh full of toys with which to fill the children's stockings. The poem was enormously popular and promoted a homey, child-centered version of Christmas that was embraced by many Americans who were themselves enjoying a rapid rise of living standards. This trend only continued to accelerate into the 20th century, and is this image of Christmas that is the source of so much excitement and enjoyment for children and their parents today. Yet the child-focused abundance and leisure we now associate with Christmas was made possible by industrialization, capital, and the hard work of so many generations that came before us. But children's toys are not the only form of luxury that endures from the spread of consumerism during the Victorian era. For example, if luxury constitutes a good or service that is not necessary for survival, then we must conclude that the Christmas tree is an unnecessary luxury, and live organic Christmas trees could be defined as the most wasteful of all. After all, Christmas trees are used only once for only a few weeks and then are thrown out or at least chopped into firewood. Surely that money should be spent on something quote-unquote useful. But for well over a century, Americans at least, have been blowing their money on this luxury, consumerist item that is the Christmas tree. Not surprisingly, the Christmas tree has not exactly met with approval from killjoys of previous generations. As late as 1883, the old guard could barely contain its disdain for the Christmas tree, with one writer opining in the New York Times that, quote, the German Christmas tree, a rootless and lifeless corpse, was never worthy of the day, unquote. But in America, as in most of Europe, the Christmas tree won out against most doubters. Today we find Christmas trees far beyond the borders of the old German lands, with trees displayed prominently even in places not exactly known for their evergreen forests, from Rome to the Holy Land and to Tucson, Arizona. But even in countries where evergreen trees grow in abundance, the realities of daily life and the division of labor meant the world needed markets and entrepreneurs to actually get all those Christmas trees to the consumers. As with the growing toy markets during the early years of industrialization and during the Victorian period, markets had to intervene to deliver the goods that people wanted. In other words, the continued popularity of Christmas trees would never have been possible without the people who worked to deliver Christmas trees at an affordable price. By doing so, they make and made trees available to city dwellers and others who live too far from untouched groves of firs and spruces to allow for harvesting as done in what's supposedly the style of olden times. As the urban American population grew larger and as the German Christmas tree, quote-unquote, grew in popularity, entrepreneurs were already finding ways to bring trees to Americans who didn't have access to the coniferous forests of North America. In his book, Inventing the Christmas Tree, Bernd Brunner writes, quote, in 1880, no fewer than 200,000 trees were brought from the Catskill Mountains and the whole New England region by train, boat, and wagon to New York City's Washington Market, a popular place for buying wholesale foods and vegetables. Alongside turkeys and Santas, heaps of trees signaled the coming Christmas season. And what was purely a men's affair before, going into the forest in search of a suitable tree, came more into the women's sphere. They could now take part in the selection of a tree. Unquote. Thus, thanks to these tree merchants, Christmas trees also became available to single mothers, the disabled, and people who didn't own their own means of personal transportation. Scarcity, however, has remained always a problem, even though North America's forests appear immense. Harvesting enough trees in the vicinity of America's cities is not easy. This has long been especially true for the Great Plains region or the American Southwest, where trees of any sort are relatively scarce. Over time, the ongoing problem of finding fresh trees gave birth to the artificial Christmas tree. Brunner suggests some of the earliest trees were born out of wartime scarcity, when a few pieces of greenery, a candle, or a burning pine shaving served as reminders, and when some drilled holes in a broomstick and stuck in fir sprigs. Nor is the need for artificial trees a modern problem. As Brunner notes, quote, in 19th century Germany, a feather tree was marketed. Instead of branches, it bore large feathers, dyed green, and meant to create the illusion of a real tree. Such trees were also available in the United States, where they could be purchased with red artificial berries that functioned as candle holders, unquote. Since then, the world of artificial trees has become exceptionally varied. Trees of all sorts, from trees that appear to be covered in snow to abstract, modernist-looking trees, can be found. Pink metal trees, of course, were part of the joke about the commercialization of Christmas as featured in A Charlie Brown Christmas. Those who want real-looking trees can have them. Many artificial trees today look quite real unless inspected up close. Even better, many artificial trees are far less prone to catching fire than natural trees. The flammability of Christmas trees, of course, has long been a concern of tree owners and a detail long pointed out by early critics of placing a tree corpse in one's home. Nowadays, one can even buy a smoke detector shaped like a Christmas tree ornament to further minimize risk. With Christmas trees, as with toys, what was once an inaccessible luxury has become central to the family rituals of Christmas time. Yet, the joyless critics of so-called consumerism over the decades do not appear to be defeated. Even today, wherever we look, Christmas, we are told, is a story of excess, and we all need to get back to the real meaning of Christmas. One must wonder, however, if all this supposed concern for too much consumerism at Christmas comes with ulterior motives. It is probably not a coincidence, for example, that modern concerns over an excessive amount of goods and services often comes from those who demand more taxes, regulations, central planning, and other efforts to force us all to return merely to what is necessary. The Green New Deal and the Great Reset are but two examples. Thanks to all this quote-unquote consumerist luxury, the story goes, we've ruined the environment, our culture, and even our own families and lives. What is necessary, however, is to be decided for us. That is, by the ruling elite who fancy themselves qualified to make such a determination of necessity. Like the aristocrats of old, today's ruling class believes only they can be trusted with controlling access to the fruits of human industry. Otherwise, the ordinary folk might use these fruits unwisely or for politically unacceptable ends. All this buying of toys and Christmas trees, we are told, is simply not something we need. A dose of skepticism is certainly in order. The aristocrats who condemned consumerism couldn't stand seeing common folk enjoy some of the same luxuries as the upper classes. Yet, the upper classes rarely volunteered to cut back on their own luxuries. The same appears to be true today. But if the well-off social critics of today are so concerned with the impact of consumer goods on virtue, nowadays defined perhaps as the level of one's wokeness and fondness for social democracy, let them teach by example. Let the New York and Washington elite give up their posh vacations, their private jets, luxury cars, and their second and third homes. Let the intellectuals donate their university salaries to others. Until that happens, we can safely ignore everything the tiresome anti-consumerist moralists have to say about your Christmas tree or what is under it. Thank you for listening to this episode of Radio Rothbard. We'll be back next week with more, and we'll see you next time.